And the SNP starts this election in fantastic shape. This election is about booting Boris Johnson out of Downing Street, escaping Brexit, perhaps you could say getting Brexit ditched, and protecting the mandate as well given to the Scottish Parliament by the people of Scotland to give the people of Scotland the choice of a better future as an outward-looking, inclusive, independent Scotland. We have thousands of SNP activists speaking to voters on the doorsteps across our nation, and our party has never been better prepared to take on Boris Johnson and his right-wing Brexiteer Tory party. Friends, the Westminster parties are running scared of the SNP, not so much running, giving the defections, former Labour MPs telling people to vote Tory and all the nonsense with different candidates. They're more stumbling. But the SNP is in fine shape, so we have to get out there and win this election. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our party leader, by far the most formidable party leader anywhere in these islands. And she's working tirelessly to stand up for Scotland's interests and holding the failing Westminster system to account. And she will also soon lead us into another independence referendum and enable us to choose a better future as an independent country. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Scotland's First Minister, SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, MSP.
Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the launch of the SNP's 2019 general election campaign. It's true to say that every election is important, but this election is the most important of our lifetimes. It really matters. The future of our country is at stake, not just for the next 5 years, but for the generations to come. This election in Scotland is about who we are as a nation and who has the right to decide our future. Over the past 2 decades, Scotland has been on a journey. We've re-established our Scottish Parliament. We've become a more inclusive and a more tolerant country. We are more European, quite literally, as thousands of our fellow EU citizens have made Scotland their home. With the SNP in government, the principle of free education has been re-established. We've extended free personal care and abolished prescription charges. We've put the progressive principle back into our tax policy. And we're building a social security system with dignity, fairness and respect at its very heart. We've kept our National Health Service in public hands, protecting it from creeping privatisation. And we have the best performing accident and emergency services anywhere in the United Kingdom. Scotland is a world leader in renewable energy and in the fight against climate change. We're on a path to becoming a zero emissions country 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK. And we're making our voice and our values heard in Europe and on the international stage. So we have made real progress, but there is much still to do. As we look to the future, we must build a more prosperous, sustainable economy so that everyone can get on in life. We need to become a fairer and a more equal society. In short, we must continue the mission of building a better Scotland. But make no mistake, right now, many of the gains of the last 20 years and the promise of a better future are under threat. Scotland's vote to remain in the EU has been ignored. The Conservative Party has ridden roughshod over the Scottish Parliament. For the very first time, the UK government has chosen to legislate on devolved matters without the consent of the Holyrood Parliament. With so-called moderate Conservatives in full retreat and the hardline Brexit ultras on the march, that is surely only a taste of what is to come. The Tories' number one pledge at this election is to take Scotland out of the EU against our will. Now, I doubt that there is anyone in Scotland who is not heartily sick of the Brexit nightmare. But the Boris Johnson deal does not get Brexit done. It just opens the door to the next episode of the Brexit horror show. His Brexit deal covers the exit terms, not the future relationship. Ahead of us would lie many years of wrangling over the UK's future economic relationships, justice and security arrangements, fisheries, migration, and much more. What we do know is that the Tories will take Scotland out of the customs union and out of the single market, a trading bloc that is 8 times bigger than the UK alone. That will hit jobs and living standards hard. Economic analysis says that it will cost every person in Scotland £1,600. It will take away rights and opportunities, and it will put Scotland at a competitive disadvantage to Northern Ireland with no say over our future. Under the Tory deal, England will have voted to leave and will leave. Wales will have voted to leave and will leave. Northern Ireland will get a special deal, a great deal, according to Boris Johnson in the footage we've seen today. Scotland, with the highest Remain vote of any nation in the UK, would be deprived of all of the aspects that make the deal great for Northern Ireland and instead be taken out of the EU against our will. That is undemocratic and it is unfair. But of course, that's not even the worst of it. The Tories have set an impossible deadline to conclude trade negotiations. That means in little over 1 year's time, there will be a renewed and a very real risk of leaving the EU with no trade deal in place. And you know, that's why the Brexit ultras support Boris Johnson. They want a no-deal Brexit. And on the present course, that's exactly what he will deliver. As for Labour, Jeremy Corbyn still can't even tell us whether he is for Remain or for Leave. Instead, Labour say they will negotiate yet another Brexit deal. But just like the Johnson deal, a Corbyn deal would take Scotland out of the EU against our will. And for the Liberal Democrats, despite all their talk, maintaining Westminster control over Scotland, even under Boris Johnson, is more important to them than maintaining Scotland's place in Europe. When it comes down to it, the Liberal Democrats in Scotland are not the party of Remain. They're just another party of Westminster. They would rather subject Scotland to a Tory Brexit than give people in Scotland a choice over our future. So Westminster's priorities can be summed up in just 3 words: Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. A vote for the SNP, in contrast, is a vote to escape Brexit. A vote for the SNP is a vote to take Scotland's future out of the hands of Boris Johnson and a broken Westminster system. A vote for the SNP is a vote to put Scotland's future firmly in Scotland's hands. The SNP is unambiguously Scotland's Remain party. We want Scotland to remain inside the EU, and we want the UK to remain inside the EU. So just as we have done over the past 3 years, SNP MPs will work with other parties to try to stop the UK from being taken out of the European Union. And if there is a hung parliament after this election, an outcome that could give Scotland the balance of power, SNP MPs would seek to form a progressive alliance to lock the Tories out of government. Our MPs will work with others to protect Scotland and to advance a progressive policy agenda across the UK. In particular, we will fight tooth and nail any attempt to expose the National Health Service to a post-Brexit trade deal with Donald Trump. That is why, after this election, SNP MPs will bring forward a new law, an Nhs Protection Bill, to explicitly protect the NHS in all 4 countries of the UK from being a bargaining chip in future trade deals. That bill would prevent private companies from taking legal action through investment protection or investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms. It would ensure that confidential discounts for expensive medicines would not be at risk, and it would stipulate that before any trade deal could come into force, the Scottish Parliament and the other devolved legislatures would need to give their explicit consent. No new deal could be ratified unless the Scottish Parliament, National Assembly for Wales and Northern Ireland Assembly had agreed that the deal did not adversely impact their respective health services. That is a concrete example of how the SNP will use our influence at Westminster, and any party that wants our support will need to match us. And over this campaign, the SNP will set out other priorities for our MPs in the next Parliament, not just for Scotland, but for the benefit of the UK as a whole. We will demand a real end to austerity, with new investment to support public services and create opportunities for our young people, and an end to billion-pound bungs to the DUP at the expense of Scotland and other parts of the UK. Powers over migration, so that we can grow our population, not see it decline as a result of a hostile environment policy that harms our society and our economy. The immediate devolution of drug laws to allow us to better tackle the public health emergency that we face. Powers over employment law, so that we can protect workers' rights and increase the living wage. Real action on climate change, demanding that the UK goes further and faster and matches the scale of Scotland's world-leading ambitions. An end to the two-child cap, the abhorrent rate clause, and an end to the iniquity of universal credit, which is pushing so many families into poverty. No more nuclear weapons on the Clyde, and the right of the people of Scotland to choose our own future. The SNP will always stand up for Scotland at Westminster, and we will always stand up for the progressive values that so many across the UK cherish. But after these last 3 years, it is impossible to escape the conclusion that for Scotland, Westminster is utterly broken. It is taking Scotland down the wrong path, and it is doing so against our will. Our place in Europe, the future of our NHS, the kind of country and society that we want to be, should not be for Westminster to decide. And it should certainly not be for a Tory government with no mandate in Scotland to impose upon us. At this election, therefore, there is a fundamental question at stake for Scotland. Who will decide our future? Will it be Boris Johnson, or will it be the people of Scotland? My intention is that the people of Scotland will decide Scotland's future in an independence referendum next year. The SNP, of course, already has a cast-iron mandate for an independence referendum based on our explicit manifesto pledge for the 2016 Holyrood election. So if the SNP wins this election in Scotland, the question should not be to me or to the SNP, what will you do if Westminster refuses? The question must be to Boris Johnson and to Westminster. What gives you the right to block the democratic wishes of the people of Scotland? That is an undemocratic, untenable, and ultimately unsustainable position. There will be no Westminster veto over Scotland's right to choose our own future and build the kind of country we want to be. The fact is, Scotland is one of the world's wealthiest countries. We have talent and resources in abundance. Nations of our size, many of them with many fewer advantages than Scotland, many of them top the league for national income per head, well-being and happiness. With our world-class universities, cutting-edge industries, vast green energy potential, and one of the world's most highly skilled populations, we should be entering a golden era for Scotland. With independence, our country will thrive, And at this election, we have a precious opportunity to secure the right to choose that better future. So my message to the people of Scotland at this vital, defining election is this. If you are sick of the chaos that you've seen played out at Westminster on television night after night after night, vote SNP to escape Brexit. If you fear the prospect of an increasingly extreme right-wing Tory government under Boris Johnson, vote SNP to deprive him of the majority he craves. If you despair at Jeremy Corbyn and his lack of leadership on Brexit, vote SNP to make sure Scotland's voice is heard. And if you believe that decisions about Scotland are best taken by the people of Scotland, that our future should be ours to determine, not imposed upon us by the likes of Boris Johnson, vote SNP to put Scotland's future into Scotland's hands. And then let's get on with the job of building a better, fairer European nation for this and for the generations to come. Thank you very much indeed. Now I'll take some questions from our friends in the press. Brian.
Thank you very much, Brian Taylor, BBC Scotland. You said at one point during your remarks that you're looking at options as to ways to thwart Brexit, and yet, and I understand why you do this, you look at the political UK parties and say they're each engaged upon a Brexit project. Does that mean that in practice, in terms of your SNP strategy, you're now wholly focused on independence as the way to thwart and reverse Brexit rather than Westminster compromises?
Well, we will not give up on trying to stop Brexit for the whole of the UK. I think the positions of the other parties make Brexit look ever more inevitable, but other parties are deeply split, and we will see what the arithmetic is in the House of Commons after this election. But just as my colleagues, many of them here today, have done over the past 3.5 years, we will look to form alliances and build majorities in the House of Commons to stop Brexit. We will support, if there is a majority for it, a second EU referendum. If it came down to a choice between a no-deal Brexit and revoking Article 50, we would support revoking Article 50. But the experience of the past 3 years has shown us in Scotland that we cannot rely for our own future on good sense breaking out at Westminster, because we may, on the experience of the last few years, be waiting a very, very long time. So that's why central to this campaign from the SNP is the message that if we want to build the kind of country we know Scotland can be, we must take that future into our own hands. The choice for the people of Scotland in this election is who decides. Is it Boris Johnson or other Westminster politicians, or whatever our future is to be, is it the people of Scotland who decide that? And that question is central to the SNP's campaign in this election. Colin.
You say that Westminster's position in stopping you giving the powers to hold another referendum is unsustainable. But we heard from the Prime Minister yesterday. So how do you stop? How do you break that Boris blockage?
Well, it's not proved particularly hard for anybody thus far to break the Boris blockage, because nothing he said...
You couldn't break the Theresa May blockage, so how do you break the Boris blockage?
Nothing Boris Johnson has said in his short tenure as Prime Minister has turned out to be the case. So perhaps that should give us all hope for the future. I'd make 2 points on this. Firstly, if you listen to Boris Johnson's comments yesterday, what he appeared to be saying to Scotland, pretty much in terms, is, I don't care how Scotland votes. However you vote, I'm going to ignore you. Now, I would say to the people of Scotland, this election is a great opportunity for us to show Boris Johnson exactly what we think of such a contemptuous and disrespectful attitude towards Scottish democracy. But secondly, the position Boris Johnson articulated yesterday is not a sensible, serious or sustainable position, that he will block Scottish democracy forever and a day. And I will predict confidently at this podium here today that that position that he articulated yesterday will turn out to have a shelf life only about as long as his "we will leave the European Union on the 31st of October, do or die" or I'll be dead in a ditch somewhere otherwise. This is not a man whose word from day to day can be taken seriously. But more fundamentally, it is the power of public opinion in Scotland that will see that position proven to be unsustainable. We already see it crumbling before our eyes in the Labour Party, and I don't think it will be long before we see it happening elsewhere. Robert.
First Minister, you said you are seeking a progressive alliance to keep the Tories out of government. Does that mean that you are seeking to put Jeremy Corbyn into 10 Downing Street? You've also just said that you think that Boris Johnson's statement he would never support an independence referendum has a duration of perhaps even just a few weeks. So are there circumstances in which you could support a Boris Johnson government?
No, in a word. Can I just make clear the SNP's position? If there is a hung parliament after this election, which in many ways is potentially the best outcome for Scotland because it gives us significant influence and power in that scenario. I don't get to choose the leaders of the UK political parties. I think it's fair to say if I did, none of the current incumbents would be in those positions. And that's, I guess, my way of saying I'm no fan of Jeremy Corbyn. But we have to work with what we have before us. I would never support a Conservative government. I can't foresee the SNP being in a formal coalition, but we would look, as we've said in the previous two general elections, to form alliances that can keep the Tories out of power. As I've said today, we would drive a hard bargain. There would be significant issues that we would want to advance for any support from the SNP. And any party, if that's Labour after the election, that finds itself in a minority situation needs the support of other parties. I can say that from experience because I am the leader of a minority government just across the way from here right now. So that position gives Scotland significant influence, but the first step we've got to take to make sure we can get there is vote in a way in Scotland that helps deprive Boris Johnson of the majority he wants and put the SNP into the driving seat of the progress we want to see. Andy. Sorry, I'll come to you next, Beth.
Thank you. Andy Bell, 5 News. Just to be clear then, are you saying the price of you assisting Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street in the event of a hung parliament would be a promise from him explicitly to have an independence referendum next year?
That's not something that I'm saying today that is new. I said just a few weeks ago, any party that doesn't respect this fundamental principle that it is for the people of Scotland to decide the future, whether that is independence or not, it is for the people of Scotland to decide. Any party that doesn't respect that needn't bother picking up the phone to the SNP to look for support. So that is a clear principle that we have articulated. As I set out, though, there would be many other issues that we would seek to advance. The end to austerity, a different position around the social security system, until such times as Scotland is independent, devolution of significant powers that we need to tackle the challenges we face here, greater action from UK governments on climate change. So there would be a significant number of things in Scotland's interest, but in many of these issues in the interest of the whole UK that we would seek to advance in any discussions that happen after the election.
But without that explicit promise, Jeremy Corbyn can forget it.
I think yes was the long-winded way of answering that question, so I'll give you the shorter version. Yes. Beth.
Thank you. First Minister, you just said that a vote for the SNP would be a vote to escape Brexit, but given that it will be the Conservatives or the Labour Party most likely to form the next government, isn't the best chance to escape Brexit for Scottish people to vote Labour and then at least get a second referendum?
I think it's hard for anybody to conclude. I think you can take the short answer to that question is no, but I'll give you the longer-winded one as well. We don't even know whether in a future referendum on the issue of European Union membership, which, as I said earlier, the SNP would support, we don't even know whether the leader of the Labour Party would be arguing for the UK to remain in the EU or to leave the EU. How any leader of any party in this election can ask people to vote for them when they can't even give a straight answer on that big defining question of the day is frankly beyond me. So if you want in Scotland to vote for a party that is unambiguously for Scotland's membership of the EU, that wants to see the UK remain in the EU, then I would argue, in my entirely unbiased opinion, that voting SNP is the best way to achieve that. Any final questions? I'll take Kieran.
Kieran Andrews from The Times. First Minister, you said that you would not back a Conservative government under any circumstances and laid out your conditions for supporting a Labour government. So what do you do if Labour, as they've said they will do this week, say we're not playing ball and you back us or let Boris Johnson to Downing Street?
Well, look, I mean, I think one of the many things that has been learned over the past wee while in Westminster is that parties can't just always get a general election at the drop of a hat when they want one. The reality is, and as I say, and you know this, Kieran, I do on this issue of how minority government works and what you need to do to maintain a minority government, I do speak from a position of some experience. And the reality is, any minority Labour government that wanted to deliver any of its policies and sustain itself in government would need the support of the SNP. If the SNP is in the House of Commons, as I hope we will be in numbers, that's the reality of the situation, and it gives the SNP, and by extension, given that we are there to represent Scotland's interests, Scotland, significant influence and significant power, which is why the more SNP MPs there are after this election, the more influence that we will have. I've got time for a couple more questions. I'll take Sev at the back.
First Minister, Severin Crowell at The Guardian. One of the key challenges for Corbyn, and arguably for you, in Westminster, were Corbyn to be in a position to have a minority government, would be getting a budget passed. Are you saying the SNP would not support a Labour government's budget if Corbyn didn't promise to allow you to have a referendum next year?
I'm making pretty clear, and I don't think anybody taking a step back from this would be surprised to hear me say that the SNP is not going to be giving support to parties that do not recognise the central principle of the right of the people of Scotland to choose their own future. As it happens, and you know, whatever he might say to spare Richard Leonard's blushes in the course of this election campaign, I'm not sure that's a position that Jeremy Corbyn will find himself in. Jeremy Corbyn is somebody who supports self-determination for literally every other country in the world. It would be mighty strange if he didn't support it for Scotland. And the comments that he's made, the comments that John McDonnell have made, I think give a fairly clear sense of the direction of Labour's travel in this. As I say, they have to sometimes couch that in a way that allows the Labour leadership in Scotland not to be too embarrassed, given this completely incredible and ridiculous nature of their position. Right, time for one more here.
Thank you. Labour has suggested that it might be willing to accept the principle of Scotland having a second independence referendum, but in the later years of Labour government or after the Scottish parliamentary election in 2021. Is that an issue on which you would be prepared to compromise?
Well, that comment does show that Labour's position is moving in the right direction, but that's not accepting a principle, because the principle is actually this. The principle is that the question of whether or not there is an independence referendum and what timescale that independence referendum should happen on is not for Westminster politicians to determine. Those are questions for the Scottish Parliament, elected by the Scottish people, to determine. So it's that principle that I would be looking to any Westminster politician to clearly and unequivocally support. And it is, I think, perplexing and should be a matter of concern, I think, to Democrats everywhere, that we actually have a situation where we have some political leaders who are not prepared to accept that straightforward, simple principle of democracy and self-determination. So, as I say, Labour, I think on this is moving in the right direction, and I'm sure the more SNP MPs are returned at this election, the faster they will get to the absolutely correct position on this issue of principle. Thank you all very much for being here. I know there's a number of interview opportunities after this, so I look forward to talking to some of you in more detail. To our candidates, the very best of luck as you hit the campaign trail. I look forward to joining all of you over the next 5 weeks. Thank you.